Welcome to the Humanist Podcast. I'm your host, Ken Stearns. Join us on a journey where we unravel the intricacies of workplace dynamics. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Humanist. It's our first episode here on Friday, February 2nd, 2024. Kind of lines up beautifully with my lovely 444 number that I started seeing around my little world as I was creating the JAR idea, the JAR podcast, writing my book, Dear God. And so I thought it was a clever time to start this new show. And the Humanist is really all about kind of searching to find out what is it, in pursuit of flourishing, really around being a human here on Earth. And what does it look like to flourish, much like the flower, the definition of a garden that's flourishing. And I think the report for about a year ago, 2022, the report for 2022, and we'll soon get to one for 23, it said about 40% of employees at the workplace are burned out. So if you look at that, that's kind of looking out over your garden. And if you were a tomato grower or, a corn farmer or whatever kind of a, little garden you had in your backyard, if, roughly 40% of it looked wilted and brown and barely kind of surviving, you'd want to change the soil or change the air or change the fertilizer or change something. And we are at that place right now. Certainly, I think globally, where a lot of the employees and people we work with and people we kind of walk around with, aren't flourishing. And so what I wanted to do is put this podcast together, kind of talk about what is flourishing, what does it look like, what does it look like at work, and what are the different people that are out there doing things that can kind of help us. And sometimes that's from an employment space, being a boss. Sometimes that's being a creator, like our next guest, Michael Nathans, is a multi-patent holder, and we were talking offline. A couple of your patents, Michael, both kind of social, beautifully social animals, what you've got, and we'll talk a little bit to come back to Michael in a minute. First out, before I do anybody, I was thinking about the show, and I'm asking the guest to pull a question from the jar. It's a bit of a backstory on the jar, but suffice to say, there's 444 questions in here, and I always thought I'd start off the show by asking the guest to do a question after about 20 minutes, and we'll get Michael's turn. But I thought I'd start off the show doing my own. I'm going to ask the guest to read a question from the show. I should definitely do one myself. There we go. It kind of works. So my question is, have you ever seen someone change themselves to become a better human? And I think the answer is, yes, for me. Ooh, quick one. I'll do a dad story. So I think my father would have been a great example. He was not the perfect husband by far. Had a couple of families, secret family. I was the secret second family, and my mom didn't know anything about it. And over time, obviously, no secrets are forever, and that one came out. And I think over time, he really truly came to love my mother in a way that I don't think that he even understood. And it's because he changed himself over time, and or life changed him, over the years. And it was those last 10 years, 15 years of marriage that I think he truly fell in love with her and became a different person as well. So that's my story. He became a better human. I think he flourished at the end. He kind of held off, but he flourished at the end when it mattered most. Michael, welcome to the show. Thanks for being a guest and taking some time out on your Friday morning.
Good to be here. Thank you, Ken. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and thanks for replying to my my note. I sent out a couple hundred invites, and I'll probably have about 20 out of that 20 guests, maybe a little bit less. But you're one of the first ones in, and on the first day. So I really appreciate you.
I'm an innovator.
Yeah, and you truly are. And kind of a side fact, Michael and I were both in a very interesting niche part of the insurance industry for a hot minute in our careers. And so it just shows you never know what job you may have, what role you may have. And it's definitely one of the stepping stones in life, and not, probably not your oil platform that you're going to be on your whole life. Although some people do that. But you're an innovator, and you're probably a serial innovator, I would guess. This might not be your last rodeo. Michael, tell us a little bit about what you're doing now. I think it's fascinating what the place you're playing in. And I was talking before. I had both my brother and a good friend of mine are using the mask for sleep. They have sleep apnea, and they're using the mask at night and the device to kind of not drowned continually throughout the night. And why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're doing now with Whisper Psalm and what your current role is? What does your day look like? What's your life look like?
Well, I am the one of four co-founders and the CEO of Whispersom Corporation, and we are a medical device and an informatics company that has come up with a unique treatment for sleep apnea. And we were motivated to do this by the inventor who has sleep apnea, one of my co-founders, who uses CPAP. But his dentist one day suggested that maybe he could come up with an alternative kind of device that has maybe something on the wrist and, something a little bit more advanced than that, mask and hose, which is uncomfortable for, a lot of people. And,
Mm-hmm.
It certainly works for those that can use it.
Yeah.
And use it, but I will say use it all night. And we
Mm.
can get into the reasons for why you need to use it anything all night a little later. But the point is that what's available today is so uncomfortable. Most people don't use it at all, which is why only 5% of people who have sleep apnea are treated. 5%, and this is a
Wow.
life-threatening disease, and it can start when you're an adolescent. And the problem is that the damage from apnea is cumulative. And if you aren't treated as an adolescent, you become a sick adult with diabetes and learning disorders on the way as an adolescent, and a lot of things that hold you back in life. And so we think it's really important to stop that from happening, because it's expensive for employers. We were talking about employers a little while ago, and this untreated sleep apnea costs employers about $7,000 per untreated employee who has sleep apnea per year,
Per
in
year.
the form of extra healthcare costs, absenteeism, and workplace accidents. So this is according to a Harvard School of Sleep Medicine and McKinsey and Company study that was done in 2010, a landmark study. And when I started with Whispersom about that long ago, it seems, really in 2014, but the study had been out for 4 years, and I read it, and it was one of the first studies I read when I was thinking about getting involved in this. And I saw that there was not only a real social problem at public health, an unmet public health need, number one, but the economic side of this really surprised me. What it costs employers and insurance companies is incredible. And there's a simple formula to figure out how much. And it's the number of employees or people in an insurance plan times the prevalence rate of sleep apnea in society, which is about 7% roughly.
Okay.
Some people think it's higher, and it may be. But using some published figures, 7% is a good one. And then about a 88% treatment rate. If you want to be aggressive, I think it's less than that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, an 88% untreated rate.
Untreated, right? That makes more sense.
So that would be a 12% treatment rate. I think it's really more like 5.
You said
But,
5, yeah.
Using some conservative numbers, if you run those numbers on large employee base,
Wow.
the numbers are astounding. Just to give you an example, since we're talking about this, I think it's really interesting. So, for example, the largest private sector employer, let's say it's Walmart, with about 2.3 million employees, sleep apnea is costing them close to $1 billion untreated sleep apnea amongst their employee base. For an employer this size, is costing them about $1 billion a year. I mean, that's kind of like a lot of money. It's like 2.7 million a day. 2.7 million a day.
Even for Walmart, that's real numbers.
It's real numbers, but it's real numbers for employers. but their employees are their most valuable assets. And so,
Yeah.
they're turning brown in the field, like you were saying before,
Yeah.
and costing, the employer and the shareholders, a lot of money, but they're not having a good quality of life themselves. If so, and it's not really employers' fault, but I think, they could be a little bit more proactive about screening their employees and guiding them towards a treatment that they can tolerate, whether it's CPAP or,
Mm.
an oral appliance or, whatever is FDA approved that will keep them from having apneas at night because they just get sicker by the night if they're untreated. So, that's it's kind of the mission we're on, if you will. Um, but it's there's some real science behind what we do, and it's just different than everything else out there. Everything else is sort of like a constant, continual treatment. Meaning, if it's and by the way, we firmly believe, myself and everyone in my company believes that one size does not fit all when it comes to treating sleep apnea
Mm.
or some other diseases as well, as you well know. Um, So, but with a 5% treatment rate, we think that, the more treatments that are out there like ours that people can try and see if they can, get used to and use all night. And that's the key, is using it all night. Because if you take it
Yeah.
off
This is,
halfway through the night, you're going to have apneas that are going to, again, the harm is cumulative. Every time you have an apnea, your heart rate spikes and it stresses your heart. And you produce, of all things, epinephrine, which is like adrenaline because you
yeah.
think you're suffocating.
Yeah. You're suffocating.
And,
Yeah. You're,
and
you're literally drowning.
yeah, you're laying there sleeping, and all of a sudden your body goes into panic mode. Every time you have an apnea, and you can have, if you have moderate apnea, sleep apnea, like, say 25, 30 an hour, you can be having 200 of these a night, 200 of these episodes a night. Where your body's releasing essentially adrenaline because you think you're about to suffocate and you go into the fight or flight mode. And
Yeah.
when you release adrenaline or epinephrine, it gets your cells to make glucose. And think about this for a minute. So here you are, you're an adolescent and you're having these apneas in your sleep and your body's, you know, going into panic mode many times during the night as a kid, and you're producing this epinephrine that's making your body make glucose that you don't use because
Yeah.
you're
You
just
don't.
laying there trying to sleep.
Yeah.
And you wind up developing diabetes and you're not getting enough sleep, and you wake up hypertense the next day because you've released all this epinephrine at night. It's hanging around in your system, and you're irritable and you can't learn, and it's
Whew.
it's very unhealthy. And moms have a key role to play in this.
Yeah. Yeah. How do
Mom,
you know? How would a kid know?
well, kid, no one knows if they're asleep. Even
Yeah.
adults,
Yeah.
if you're asleep and you stop breathing, you don't know that. You
Yeah. You
know,
don't know.
but the way a lot of adults find out is their bed partner tells them.
Right.
And what most people who we've done our field trials with, it's usually I interview husband and wife, and it's usually the husband who is trying our device. Several women have, by the way, and used it very successfully. But the story, is it gets so familiar because we're sitting there, I'm taking all the information about his height, weight, and making sure he qualifies and meets the inclusion criteria for our protocol. And the conversation usually goes something like this. I mean, the wife usually says, his snoring really annoys me, but when he stops breathing, it terrifies me. And I start counting the seconds before I, give him a nudge. And then it's really interesting because, the conversation goes further, and, it's usually the same thing. And something like, you know, you know, how it is, with us, with women, we hear everything. We hear the baby cry when the baby's
Yeah.
hungry. We hear the teenager come in after curfew. We hear the doorknob turn in the bedroom. We hear everything. So, she thinks she's saving his life. And the first night of our test is usually a diagnostic to get a baseline. So our device
Okay.
is both a diagnostic and a treatment device. So it records everything like a sleep lab polysom without all the wires. And it produces a report. And among other things, it lists all the apneas that happened in ascending order of duration. In other words, how long they lasted.
Okay.
And I show up the next morning with this list of like 200 apneas. And, they start at, 1 second, 2 seconds, it's a long list, but then they get to 20 seconds. And by the
Whoa.
time, this
Whoa.
happens every time. When you show someone a list like this, they start looking down the list, and the person who said, "Yeah, we hear everything at night," says, "You mean I slept through all these?" And then they get to 20 seconds, and then they get to 30 seconds, and 40 seconds, and 50 seconds. And these apneas are lasting that long. There's not just one. There's a bunch, like 87 in this case that were longer than 20 seconds. And the next thing they say is, "And you mean they lasted this long?" And I slept through them. But when you're asleep, that's what happens. No one knows. So
You're
if you're
you're asleep. When you're asleep, you're
asleep,
really asleep.
yeah, exactly. So, unless you're wearing some test equipment, there's no way to know. But if you're a mom, you are essentially the chief medical officer of your household, right?
Yes.
I mean, you take care of the kids and you usually take care of everyone else. And, but what's important for moms is to listen to how their kids are breathing at night. And if they hear their kids snoring, they really need to listen to see if they stop breathing for 10 seconds or longer. Moms can screen their kids at home like this. And if the kids are complaining that they're tired in the morning, like most kids do,
Yeah.
it could be
Yes.
because of sleep apnea, not just because they stayed up too late or have too active a life where they, can't, a lot of kids are, dragging their butts around, because, they're very active, but, some are because they're not getting enough restful sleep. I mean, they may lay in bed for 6 to 10 hours sometimes and can't get out of bed because they're still tired because they're not getting rest
Yeah.
while they're
Yeah.
asleep.
Absolutely.
They're struggling to breathe while they're asleep. And think about this. If your airway is closed off for 40 seconds and you take a breath every 5 seconds, that's 8 times you've tried to inhale against a closed airway. And what it looks like when someone's going through this is you can see their chest heaving and they're struggling to get that air in, and it's just not happening. And then all of a sudden they'll sort of wake themselves up and they'll snort and try to go back to sleep. And this happens over and over again with people who have sleep apnea. So even if you have mild sleep apnea, and this is the crazy thing, mild sleep apnea is like 5 an hour. Well, that's 40 in an 8-hour sleep night, and 280 in a week. And you start doing the math and realize this is a cumulative problem. You don't want to have any of these. You don't want to have 5 an hour. You don't want to have any. And you certainly don't want
It's
20 or 30, which is moderate to severe.
it that I didn't realize that that's actually people stop breathing for that long.
Yeah, I know.
20, 30 for 20 seconds,
Longer,
40 seconds.
50, 60 sometimes.
And
Sometimes it's unbelievable.
are they trying to catch a breath during that time? And then it only when they wake up is what you're recording?
Well, we're recording, really everything. And when they're trying to take a breath, what it looks like, in our trace. So
Yeah. Yeah.
we've got a trace that, represents breathing. So when it goes up, that's inhalation. When it comes down, it's an exhalation. And it plays back
Okay.
like a sleep lap polysom.
Okay.
But when they stop breathing, it goes flat. It's like flat
Yeah.
when your heart stops, really. It's the same kind of, signal trace. And it can last that long and without treatment. So, our field trial results show that when we provide treatment, no one goes over 20 seconds. And most don't, 90% don't go over 10 seconds. And most are resolved in 1 or 2 seconds. And we prevent a lot. So the shorter the apnea, the better. It's really not how many you have an hour, it's how long they last.
Okay.
So an apnea that lasts a second or two doesn't do you the harm that one that lasts 20 seconds or longer. And this is according to the scientific literature, but it makes
And
sense.
what is an apnea? Give me that kind of that definition.
Yeah,
Is that when the airway's closed or?
well, they come in 2 flavors or forms, if you will. So the one is that what you just said, when the airway is closed, that's called an obstructive apnea because
Okay.
your airway is obstructed.
Okay.
And that can happen because you're laying on your back and your tongue, falls back in your throat because of gravity. And if you roll on your side, solves the problem. For other people who have really wide physical structured neck and have a lot of sort of extra tissue or a lot of
Hmm.
tissue in this area, it can sort of obstruct the airway physically,
Okay.
where even if the tongue is not blocking, those tissues kind of, collapse sometimes when the body relaxes,
Right.
particularly when you
Right.
go into deep sleep or REM and, you just relax. And, all this area
E-
just relaxes. And if you're on
Everything
your back,
relaxes.
the tongue falls back. And, that's what, in many cases causes these. But those are obstructive apneas when your airways block, either your tongue's
Okay.
in it or your tissues have stuck together.
Okay.
The other kind is when your airways open, but your diaphragm isn't moving. And here's how all this works. Every time you take a breath, you've got a respiratory pacemaker, like your heart pacemaker that makes your heart beat. Well, you've got the
Yeah.
same thing that makes you breathe, whether you're awake or you're asleep. And it happens to be located in your midbrain, about like right in between your ears, right about here.
Okay.
And every time you take a breath, it's sort of like a cluster of neurons that form this respiratory pacemaker. This cluster gives off a signal that sends a signal down your hypoglossal nerve to open your throat. Like that device I was talking about that
Oh,
pushes your tongue
okay.
forward earlier.
Okay.
It also sends almost a simultaneous, but a secondary signal down your phrenic nerve to lower your diaphragm. Every time you take a
Oh,
breath, and it happens in that order, your throat has to be open before your diaphragm lowers, otherwise you'll create a vacuum. So this respiratory pacemaker is firing these signals to open your throat and lower your diaphragm every time you take a breath. And if the signals aren't strong enough, so for
okay.
example, your throat's open, but the signal coming down your phrenic nerve isn't strong enough to lower your diaphragm, so you don't even try to take a breath.
Okay.
So that's what's called a central apnea. So all apneas are sort of central in nature because it's a function of usually the signal strength coming out of the respiratory pacemaker, which is sort of like a centralized function, if you will.
Hmm.
Um, but they are called obstructive and central. They're two flavors. A lot of people have both, but it's usually more obstructive than central. So somebody who,
Okay.
let's say, has maybe 25 obstructive apneas an hour, may have 3 to 5 central apneas an hour. If that,
Okay.
if
And
that
you
makes
and
sense.
you
So
can
it's like
measure
a
the
mix.
you can measure the difference.
It can be measured in a sleep lab. Yes.
Huh.
Yes, definitely. And, the problem with a lot of treatments on the market is they don't treat central apneas. So, for example, that CPAP mask and hose does not treat central apneas.
No, no. Yeah.
And oral appliances that go in your mouth to keep your tongue out of your throat, they don't treat central apneas. And that device that you see on TV being advertised, the Inspire device, they got great commercials and they make fun of CPAP, but they don't treat central apneas. They stimulate the hypoglossal nerve, but not the phrenic nerve. So
Okay.
our device happens to stimulate both. So our device treats
Ah,
both obstructive and central. And the way it does it is it stimulates the auditory nerve through little earbuds made especially for sleeping. So they're very comfortable. You can lay on your side, they won't come off. And they don't dig into your ear. But our device will detect if you don't take your next breath exactly on time, and we time it to the millisecond. It whispers in your ear a sound like this. Are you ready? Psst. Did you hear that?
yeah.
It's really soft. You're not supposed to hear it while you're sleeping. It's softer than a TV. And people sleep with the TV on all the time. And we've got 20 different sounds, and they last about that long. And sometimes the first one will get somebody to inhale, in a matter of, we've seen it like in zero point 0.3 milliseconds. It's unbelievable. Sometimes it'll take 3 of those in succession, you know, but, and they're different sounds, so people won't habituate and get used to it and start ignoring it. But they're sounds that people won't recognize, and they're so soft, they're not meant to be heard when you're asleep, and people they don't cause arousals. We've done some testing with a home EEG device that detects arousals.
Yes. Yeah.
And when we stimulate people, we have, these two devices time sync so we can see if our sounds are causing people to wake up.
Yeah. To wake up a bit. Yeah.
Yeah, and they don't.
So they're not
So
coming out of REM. They're staying in the REM sleep.
they're not coming out of
And
REM and they're not coming out of deep sleep. Now, sometimes they'll come out of a light sleep, but the percentage is like 4% of the time. So we've got like close to like a 96% arousal free treatment rate. But people wake up during the night naturally anyhow, and we think that's coincidental perhaps with what we're seeing when
but
they
the
wake up.
4% might be just timing, right? Just
It,
a lucky timing.
could be. When we get more data, we'll know. We don't have enough data right now to make scientific claims. But the data we have is extremely promising, and others have done in the sleep lab what we are doing and have published those results, and our results are actually better than theirs. We just haven't, done a peer-reviewed study yet, but we're on the way.
Yeah.
We're on the way. Yeah, I'd love to publish the results we have so far. We knocked the cover off the ball, and we gave the data to the FDA, so the FDA has seen this data, and they're
Okay.
yeah, so they really encouraged us to, full steam ahead.
What an interesting idea. Just a whisper. And what's
Whisper.
happening with that? What's happening with the brain? What's going
No,
on with the trigger?
well, here's what happens when we send that signal through the auditory nerve. The auditory nerve passes through that neuronal cluster I described before that makes up the respiratory pacemaker. And if it's
Ah,
done at just the right time when the pacemaker would normally be firing anyway,
yes.
we just boost the signal enough to cause the signal to be more effective when it's
Right,
fired.
right. So using nature, using the body's own design
Exactly.
and just kind of giving it a little bit of a juice where it might not have enough.
And only in those cases. In other words, if you're breathing fine, it does nothing.
It doesn't work. Okay. It doesn't turn
It
on.
it
Okay.
records everything, but it doesn't it provides no stimulation because none's needed. And so, if you're breathing normally during the night and your CPAP's going all night, sometimes you need it, but sometimes you don't. It's going anyway.
It's going anyway. Right, right.
But listen, just to get back to CPAP for a minute, one size doesn't fit all.
Yes, yeah.
We have investors in our company, and my dad was a dentist, and he was diagnosed with sleep apnea too late in life. Unfortunately, he was about 55, but he used CPAP, rather than an oral appliance because he was a
Okay.
great jazz trumpet player, also, which we can talk about later. But he knew it would change his bite and change his lip, and throw his
Yes.
playing off. But he was pretty, dutiful in using his CPAP as, so we have investors in Whispersom that can't, really get a good night's sleep without CPAP. And what's really sad about all this is if you've heard about the Philips recall, Philips is a
Yes.
maker of CPAP machines
Yeah.
that developed a problem where the insulation around the fan, the blower motor, started to disintegrate, and those hydrocarbon-like particles started going down the hose and into
I-
people's lungs. And the problem is the company knew about this and continued to sell machines. And the FDA, they just came to a cease and desist, settlement decree with the FDA, where they paid the FDA a fine of like $350 million and agreed to stop selling these defective machines in the US. And I think the EU will probably follow. But the problem with that is that getting back to some of my investors, they have these machines and they can't live without them. And they know they're dangerous, but they feel so awful in the morning if they don't use it,
Yeah.
and they
Yeah.
don't detect any particles going down. So they've continued to use it. But when these machines aren't available anymore, and it's hard enough to get a CPAP machine to begin with. It takes months. And now and CPAP was made about half of them in the world. And now that
Okay.
supply is gone, people who need treatment, are going to have a harder time getting treatment. I mean, it's not good. With the 5% treatment rate, this is the last thing people need.
And especially people found something that works for them. At
Exactly.
least to a degree that it's better than not having it.
Yes.
And And then in reading, then I was reading that article, just going about the recall, and just shaking my head, just going,
It's so unfortunate. It's unfortunate for everybody. It's unfortunate for Phillips and all those employees. It's
oh yeah,
unfortunate for the CEO. How would you like to be the CEO of that company? You know,
God.
I mean, he had to leave, but gee whiz.
Can you imagine coming into the office that day and when it's finally, I mean, you would have known about it for a while.
Well, I don't know those details.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. It's
um,
tricky behind the scenes. We never know really
but
what happens.
but as the CEO, he didn't make it happen.
Yeah.
His responsibility is once he had knowledge, I guess. So,
Once you have knowledge, right?
yeah,
That's why you get paid the big dollars to make those hard calls.
yeah, and they're
Or
and they're hard, especially when you
or
didn't cause the problem.
yes. Yeah, but you enjoyed a big bonus as a result of the sales. So you gotta, it's time to clock in. Well, hey, we're at a good break spot. Let's do a fun question, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about humanistic stuff. We'll talk about humans and flourishing, and talk about workplace culture, and what's it like in places you've worked, and kind of the place you're trying to build, the kind of philosophy you've got. I'm going to pull a question for you, which is a little bit unusual for me. I'll let people on my original show for this. We let people obviously pull their own questions. Okay, it's a kind of a human question. Michael, what's the cost of not forgiving?
Oh, oh my goodness, it's high. It's high because if you're carrying a grudge around, if this is what we're talking about,
Yeah, yeah,
and you dwell on it, I mean, we all talk to ourselves, right? We all have thoughts and we have conversations with ourselves. And
yes.
if we're spending our time having conversations about, how to, if we feel we were wronged by somebody, how to get
Mm,
even,
get even, right?
right?
Mm,
Um, you can waste a lot of your valuable time thinking about
yeah,
things like that don't make you happy, don't make you productive. Um, and it's free will. I mean, if you can control your thoughts enough, to make the
yeah.
choice. Um, but frankly, I think some people freely choose to think about it because it does make them feel better. Unfortunately,
There, there is something about that thought, completing the thought, that feels good sometimes. Um, I was listening
I, I,
to,
I think there
yeah,
should. I think there should be an alternative in society. Meaning, for people who get to this place, there ought to be a place they can go where they can do something kinetic.
I think they're feeling like they need a kinetic release.
Right?
Agree, agree.
you know whether it's batting cage or a punching bag or a shooting range or you know paper targets, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
um but something to get it off their chest, I guess, or off their minds. um and maybe that's not the whole, and that I don't think is the whole answer. I think there's a discipline involved in forgiving, and it's got to be
mm,
deliberate. And it's hard, depending on what happened. I mean, if you look at what's happening in the Mideast, I mean, how are those people going to forgive each other? How do you how do you how do
I,
you, how do you I don't know. I mean, grace of talk about grace of God. You know,
this is a tough one, right? Where you think some
yeah.
of the stuff is it unforgivable, um, or how do you find that space? There's definitely an energy around holding on to stuff, and
Well, there is, and there's so much more, and it's hard to find. It's hard for humans, to do. Let's
mm,
face it. We're fighting human nature here. You know,
you're
you know,
fighting. It is.
you're fighting human nature. We're wired a certain way, like hardwired almost.
I think
Um,
a
you
lot of
know,
us are hardwired like this. There is the evidence though, talking about this, all the way through, which is, that even that manifestation, physical, like even a kinetic way, is really probably not the best thing either, because it does kind of hardwire that emotion to that event, right? In a way, you know,
I think it's
you're able.
temporary.
Yeah, and I think you've got that physical feeling, you've got the emotional feeling to it, and probably not good. But maybe there might be interesting to study the science behind that if you did let it go. Is that another way to truly let it go out in a kinetic fashion?
But
And
like I
then
said, I don't think it's truly the only part of the process. I think there's a process
yeah,
that involves some, mental component of, coming to the point where you just don't think about it anymore.
yeah,
Put it in the rear view mirror, and you don't let it chase you down the road, and you don't let it sit on your
yes,
shoulder, and you don't let it distract you from really enjoying the rest of your life, because you don't have that much time left, whether you think so or not.
yeah,
But
we
you
don't
can
have
spend
that
it
much.
any way you want. And, people do that and find their way and find, what suits them the best. Far be it for me to tell them, right? You
Yeah,
know,
and
it's easy to say. It's easy to tell somebody to forgive, right? Easier said than done. So,
it really is,
yeah.
especially like you said, some of the stuff that's happening in the Middle East, or you look at Ukraine and Russia, the stuff there. There's moms and dads affected by a lot of decisions. There'd be
There's
a lot of
stuff in people's families and friends and right at home, right next door, your own neighbor. I mean, it's all, it's human. It's very
oh
human.
yeah, the person, when you go to the checkout counter today, that person struggling with forgiveness.
Well, I mean, I have such a good time at the checkout counter, talking with the cashier,
I do
you know,
too. Yeah,
because a lot of them are, sort of, in high school,
yeah,
and they could be, pleasant and chatty, and I think they enjoy speaking with an adult sometimes that, is not their teacher, so to speak, or their adult, if
yeah,
you
or
will.
their adult, one of their adults.
Yeah, yeah. So it can be
Um,
fun.
let's talk a little bit about work and kind of workplace culture. What best boss you ever had?
The
Best
best
most
boss I
human. Does anybody stand out as one of those bosses? Because we've all had the different kinds. The least humanistic, the least flourishing person.
Hmm.
Um, how about the
Yeah,
best place you've worked?
gee whiz, that's
Greatest culture.
boy, that's a great question. So I've pretty much been a serial entrepreneur, so I haven't had a lot of, you know, bosses, but I've had some. And
Yeah.
I was at Price Waterhouse for 5 years, and there was an engagement
Oh,
partner who was essentially my boss, if you
okay.
will. And we had a great relationship. Um, but there was one in particular. Right after I got out of college, I went to work at a high-end stereo store in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, of all places.
I
And
love it.
it was, we sold Macintosh, the highest end, and
Okay. Okay.
these are the manufacturers that would take you to school at their plant and teach
Yes.
you all the technical things that you need to know to be really professional about representing their brand. And they were very particular and protective of their brand, and wanting it represented the way they wanted it represented, and they would go to the trouble and expense to train us how to do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was a great education, um, because you really learn some basic stuff you need to know anyway. um, but the store was run by a Mennonite couple, and
Okay.
they were just really sweet people, very well balanced, and it was just a pleasure, working with people like that. It was, they didn't yell or scream or, any of that stuff. Um, and most of the environments I've been in have been that way, except for one. And it was when I
Hmm.
started as a commercial real estate broker, and learned the the multifamily business in Philadelphia from a gentleman who had been specializing in it for years. And he was like the only guy who did apartment buildings for years. And somehow we found each other, and he taught me the business. And but he had a philosophy that as a broker, your income is a lot more steady if you try to sell 8 units, 10 unit buildings, 30 unit buildings, that size. Meanwhile, I'm learning the business, and I'm seeing all these 300 unit buildings, with $10 million price tags rather than $2.5 million price tags. And I'm working on commission, of course. So where am I going to spend my time?
Yeah.
Because, talking to the owners of, 300 units building is, if he wants to sell, is the same, effort as talking to somebody who's got 30 units. But we used to have raging battles about, deals I was working on and the likelihood that they would close. And it was just, contentious in that way, but in a constructive way, if you know what I mean.
Hmm.
Um, but it was the most sort of like contentious work situation I've been in, where it was, we did a lot of debating and it was hard. But it actually, improved my skills. I just don't like, being that kind of boss with anybody. I don't think it's necessary.
Yeah, it is interesting with those challenging times do end up solidifying your belief systems or challenging your current beliefs, right? You quite often get challenged and you have to kind of articulate why you believe something. Those are good
Yeah.
parts in life, good stations to be at.
Yeah. And it's really hard being an employer. It's hard for any boss. And, the more people you have to deal with and, getting into their personal, lives a little bit, which they bring to work, it's hard not to, it's difficult. It can be difficult. And especially when you've got your own milestones and timelines you need to meet and
Hmm.
people aren't keeping up. It's hard to deal with sometimes.
I this is interesting, right? The especially as an entrepreneur, I think you've got some real defined things you want to have happened at a certain time. That's kind of
Yes.
what
Well,
and it's
especially if you have investors and a board like I do.
yeah, yes,
Those are my bosses right now, and I love every one of them.
absolutely.
By the way, they're all very nice to me. But I work hard, and but we all get along well. And you know, one of my co-founders said to me, and this is very interesting. This is Dr. Craig Fiat. If you look him up on our website, so he sold his last company to Microsoft, and it was a medical informatics system where it was a software program that was able to take all the information when a patient came into an emergency room, all the health information from the patient's medical files and any
Mhm.
diagnostic machine they got hooked up to once they were admitted, all in one place. So the ER doc had at their or her fingertips all the information that they needed on this particular individual to make life and death decisions as quick as possible. Like when someone comes in
Yeah,
overdosed and you don't know on what and what, you know, complications they may be having based on what other medications they're taking, or someone comes in, injured with a hidden bone injury that you got to put them under, in an x-ray or MRI and get those results as soon as possible and know as much about that individual, sometimes save their life as possible. Anyhow, that's the software. That's the reason behind the software. He sold that to Microsoft and they used it to form the basis of their first healthcare division. And he ran it as the chief health strategy officer in the C-suite with Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer for 5 years, with 200 doctors and lawyers and developers under him, and a budget of over $1 billion a year. And when he retired, my point is, when he retired, he didn't have to work another day in his life. And he had, by that time, he's quite a famous doctor, actually, before he went to Microsoft. And he's got projects being presented to him all the time, and he had an
I
opportunity to work on an artificial pancreas around the time that we met. But he chose Whispersome. Of all the opportunities he had. It's like, I don't know, about 8 years ago now, 7 or 8 years ago. And my point, what he said was, I understand the science behind this. He's a biophysicist, so he
okay.
understands, how we stimulate and all that really well. And he was very skeptical at first, but he really dug in and wound up investing over $4 million in the company. and has, been my chief medical and science officer for, 7 years now. And he didn't want to be he said, I'm usually the CEO. And I asked him to join the company. He says, I'm usually the CEO, but I don't want to do that anymore. You deal with the investors. I said, thanks, Craig. I said, listen, here's the deal. Help me be the best CEO I can be. Use your knowledge and your experience. Just help me. You're going to be on the board and we're going to work together, help me with what you know. And he really has. I mean, he's amazing. I mean, he's spent a lot. He's a medical school professor, full-time at, at Georgetown. And, he, doesn't teach anymore, but spending time with him is like being with a medical school professor. I mean, I do a lot
It's
of stuff
gold,
on
right?
medical school. Yeah, it's really been very helpful. But he said to me, he said, I don't have to do anything if I don't have to work anymore, and I'll do this just so long as it's fun. The day it's not
Mm,
fun anymore, I'm going to go do something else because I can.
so can.
Because I can.
What is you mentioned? You said something that's kind of struck me. To be the best CEO you could be, and
Hmm.
how have you changed over the years since you guys met? And it's also a great growth time. You're at the right age where 6 years ago you're a different person, probably. Uh,
I don't know if we
or
ever really change basically, but we grow, right? And
yeah,
we
we
grow, and I
grow.
think
Yeah,
we usually become more like ourselves or better versions of ourselves.
I like that.
Because we've
I like
we've been
that.
ourselves for so long, it's hard to change after a certain point, right? But you can improve.
Can
Um,
improve.
and if you
How
need,
have you changed? How have you improved? What is a
I've I've gotten a lot more productive at work,
interesting?
and I'm able to concentrate a lot longer than I used to be able to, and just get more done. And what's really surprised me is the number of different things that I have to do as a CEO of a small company. So, for example, we're dealing with the FDA. We're dealing with contractors that have to, run our clinical trials. And I had to
Yeah,
search through all the contractors that do this. This is just one small part I'm talking about here.
yeah. It's just
And select the right contractor, to do the best job for us, and people that we can get along with, and
yep.
they're affordable, and all those ingredients. And I had to do that with about 3 companies and bring them before the board and make a decision, make a case which one. And it's like that with almost everything. And there's a lot of things you have to do for what we're doing, and decisions have to be made. And you got to sift through a lot of layers to get to
Yeah,
what you need to know to feel confident in the decisions you're making, because you're making them on behalf of the people who put the money in the company. It's not your decision, really, when you come right down to it. I mean, you're
yeah,
obligated to, you know, you know, make the best decision on their behalf, but they're trusting you,
yes,
to do it the right way. And there are best practices for things, right? And I think that's one of the things I've learned is, how to find best practices and apply them, because when you do, you get a better result, no matter what you're doing.
yeah. It's interesting. You have to become an expert at everything. Present it to the board and move on to the next part.
Or drag the experts in front of the board and let them do their thing and say, listen, I brought you this expert. And right? You can't,
Yeah.
but I've had to, and I got a degree in biology, so I really enjoy the science behind this. And I've sort of become, I don't know if you'd call it an expert in, the science
Hmm.
underlying, what's going on when you have an apnea, and, the treatments out there and that sort of thing. But I don't have a degree. I've just been studying this for 10 years and reading a lot of scientific papers and learning how to communicate with investors and policymakers and regulators about it. Um, but I've learned a lot. What surprises me is I didn't think I could learn that much at this age, and be this functional during the day. So it's been an awful lot of fun. I've really enjoyed this process, and the people that are on the team. It's been really enjoyable working with them. And if you look at the advisors that we have, we've got the top sleep doctors in the world on our advisory board, and
Mm,
they've been there for some for 6, 7 years now, They've been willing to put their name up alongside, what we're doing and our brand and our people, because they believe in what we're doing as experts. And what, they almost to a person said to me when I asked them to join, they said, as a pulmonologist, I prescribe CPAP, and I have to tell my patients this is, going to help you make you feel better. And they come back and say, Doc, I can't tolerate this. What else do you have for me? And they say, well, there's CPAP. And the patient says, no, Doc, you're not listening to me. I can't use CPAP. What else you got? And this is one doctor telling me this, Pat Strollo. He's on the website. He ran the
Man, that's
clinical trials
tough.
for Inspire. He says, CPAP, that's all we got. And he said to me, I'm going to join your board because we need something else.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
he says, what you're doing makes sense. I know there's science behind it, and you seem pretty dedicated, and I'll try
Well,
trusting you for a while. And it's
yeah,
worked out
and
pretty good.
one size does not fit all. So there's,
Right.
CPAC will have its place. I'm sure they'll sort out their problems, and be version 2 and version 3, and it'll be a different, better, more comfortable. But it'd be great to get one more especially as a provider, when your patient saying, please help me, this is this one doesn't work, or I
Yeah.
can't tolerate it. It's
Yeah.
working, but it's too painful.
And
The
the worst thing
process
is,
or the
when they say, listen, my wife tells me that I stop breathing at night, so I'm pretty sure I've got sleep apnea, but I don't feel that tired when I wake up, and I'm okay.
huh.
But I know I could never wear one of those devices, so I'm not even going to get a diagnosis, and here's why. If I get diagnosed, it's going to go on my medical record.
Yep.
If I don't use treatment, then, and you know this from the underwriting side, right? If I don't use treatment, and they see I've got sleep apnea untreated, okay, and it's on my medical record, it's going to be a problem for me, getting certain types of insurance, possibly even employment. So, depending on, what you're, if you're driving a truck, that sort of thing,
Oh,
public transportation, I mean, you've got to be treated. It's like mandatory. And the sad thing about that, let's talk about that for a minute, the transportation side. So some employers are very proactive about screening their truck drivers to make sure that they know whether or not they have sleep apnea, and
okay.
require them to treat themselves with CPAP if they do. And they're monitored to see how many hours a night they use it
Whoa.
by a third-party company that sells the machine to them.
Whoa.
And if they don't use it, the minimum requirement, which is 4 hours a night, 70% of nights, they can't drive for this company.
Wow.
Now think about 4 hours a night. That's half the night. Think about what happens the other 4 hours and how many apneas
Yeah.
they're having and what's really going on. And then the nights that they don't use it at all, because you only have to use it, what,
70.
7
Yeah.
times?
Yeah. 70%.
Yeah. So what's happened is the company thinks the drivers are compliant with the rules, and they are. But a report came out that shows, and it was a retrospective study of a lot of reports, and it was done for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, which is
Okay.
CMS. And it was a study done by the Agency for Healthcare Research Quality, independent group. And they do these studies a lot of times for government agencies like CMS. And they wanted to find out if use of CPAP prevents the diseases it's prescribed for. And they found that it doesn't. And the reason is,
Oh,
when CMS created the insurance reimbursement rules for CPAP,
okay.
they arbitrarily said, if you use it 4 hours a night, 70% of nights will pay for it.
Oh,
They made that decision. Now people think, well, then that must be enough, but it's not. And this study came out and it shows that it's not. Now, people who use it all night, it's effective for them. But for people who use it 4 hours a night and think they're treating themselves, it's not. They're kidding themselves. And that's what the study essentially says. And the study's this thick. I mean, it's a very credible study.
huh. So it's funny, kind of an arbitrary number that really probably had no data behind it.
Right.
Or clearly now that we have the real data.
So there's a second part of the study that questions whether the the ways that the severity of sleep apnea is expressed are tied to real health outcomes or not. So, for example, when we talk about the apnea hypopnea index as a measure of severity, how many do you have an hour? So, 5 to 10 is considered mild, 10 to over 15 is, or rather, 5 to 15 is considered mild, 15 to 25 is considered moderate, over 30 is considered severe. This is per hour. And as I said earlier, it doesn't express how long they last. And what matters is how long they last, because during that time that it's lasting, your body's producing a certain amount of epinephrine. The longer it lasts, the more epinephrine you produce, right? I mean, so it's all tied to how long they last. What the study found is just looking at it from the standpoint of how many an hour you have is not adequate.
Yeah. Okay.
It's what happens while they're going on, which is a function of how long they're lasting. And the way you measure that is you either time it like we do, and or like we also do, you measure it with a pulse oximeter, that thing you usually wear around your finger.
Yeah.
Well, there's some that go around your wrist and some that you can wear a ring. There's
Yeah.
various
Yeah.
ways to measure it. But when you stop breathing, what happens is your blood oxygen level just dives.
Oof.
And that's an indication that you're having an apnea when that happens, of course. But that's the result of it. And when your blood oxygen level dives like that, it's bad for every organ in your body. And the other interesting thing that happens is when you stop breathing and that happens, the oxygen level goes
Yes.
down. Let me back up. And I'm going to talk about concussions a little bit and central apneas. So healthy athletes that don't have sleep apnea who have concussions wind up having central apneas at night because their brain's a little bit scrambled and the respiratory pacemaker is just not sending the signal down to lower the diaphragm. Their airway may be open. CPAP wouldn't do them any good. Their diaphragm's not lowering. They're having
Low. Yeah.
central apneas. Here's the problem when you stop breathing is when you breathe, your breathing acts as kind of like a mechanical pump for the cerebral spinal fluid. It's located in your spine, in your brain. And when you breathe, it makes that fluid move. And when you go to sleep, your brain shrinks a little bit. And the spaces in between your brain, those interstitial, those folds, they open up a little bit and it lets that fluid get in there and circulate. Because what happens during the day while your brain's working is producing a lot of metabolic byproducts.
Yep.
Right. And, it's burning glucose and, converting, all kinds of things into different compounds. And some of them are toxic. And they're excreted from the cells in your brain, and they're in these interstitial spaces, and your cerebral spinal fluid is supposed to carry those away.
Yes.
When you stop breathing, the pump stops. And when you start breathing again, it takes a while for the pump to get going. So what's happening in people, it's really interesting. What's happening in people who have Alzheimer's and repeated, it's called chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So it's when, like, football players have this, when they get concussions a lot. You don't have to have your head hit to have a concussion. If you're in a car accident or get tackled real hard and your body gets jolted, your head doesn't have to get hit to have a
Your brain still hits the wall. And
exactly. And those cause central apneas, even if you don't normally have them. And if you don't treat those while you're recovering, all these toxic particles that are supposed to get washed out while you're breathing don't get washed out, and they form these clusters. They're called tau, T-A-U proteins. And they start sticking together and they form these toxic clusters that impairs your brain function. And when you do autopsies on Alzheimer's patients and football players who have chronic and traumatic encephalopathy, you find in both those cases these toxic clusters. And when you measure the cerebral spinal fluid for these, it's lower when people are using CPAP that should than when they don't. And CPAP doesn't really breathe for you. It kind of breathes for you. It doesn't get you. In other words, when it's breathing for you, you don't exert the same kind of pumping action
Right.
naturally. So it kind of like impairs that a little bit. But it's better than having apneas.
Breathing is apparently important.
Yeah, it's kind of like your heart beating.
I'm getting Michael, I'm not sure, but I'm walking away with the feeling that breathing is incredibly important in life.
Yeah, it really is. If you've ever read this book above my head here, Breath.
Yeah.
Yeah, you should read that. It's a good book.
I've been a big
Very
fan.
well
I'd say real quick side story for myself, and then we'll get you a last question for the jar and wrap things up. Through my journey with the jar, this podcast I'd done, I traveled around the country with. I ended up in a equine therapy retreat in southern Arizona.
With a pool, a horse pool,
with no pool, but just horses.
Okay.
Equines, and the idea was to really learn how to get yourself into a space, a mental space, where you could enter a pen with an animal, an equine, and connect with that animal. And equines have an incredible electrical kind of aura around them. They can.
Well, they look at you.
They look at you.
They pay attention to you. You can talk to them.
You can talk to the animals, it turns out.
Yeah.
And they have a huge electrical system. Their electrical system is huge, and the way it presents itself is like an antenna, because they're prey animals. And I didn't know, but their brain, they have this huge empathetic kind of nervous system, because they need to understand the prey, or the hunters, right? And so but the only way you can really connect is if you're in congruence, if your heart and your breath are together. Without that, no bueno. You cannot get on their frequency level. And so I learned a lot about breath, and just connecting your breath with your mind and your heart, and getting that into the same space. And so breath is, like we talked about today, it's so powerful, and especially this nighttime, the apnea and how disrupting breath. But that waking part, and using it just to show on the waking side, to walk in and have a conversation with an animal, first thing you have to do is your breath and your heart have to get aligned.
Well, I think you're calming yourself so you don't upset the animal.
And that's what it is. You're in a calm state, and then the animal says, "Oh, okay, you're together."
Yeah, exactly.
Then you and I can have a conversation, because when you're not within when you're not inside your own body and not comfortable, you're a disease. I can't talk to you.
And breathing, and I think you can control your state of mind with your breathing to some extent.
Absolutely. That's what I found out was when I could literally get myself into a place where the animal would finally look at me and go, "Oh, hi, hello.
Yeah.
I see you now."
Yes.
Before, you were a hot mess. You were breathing and your heart was going, but now hi, I see you now. It was really good.
It's good to know how to do that, even if you're not going to be talking to an equine.
Yeah, this is a really, and it turned out there is a simple device. I just saw it on late night TV being advertised, but there's a simple device you can use, which kind of measures when you're in congruence, when you've got that heart and the breath together.
Yes.
And I think it's probably a bit of a heart, bit of a blood pressure oxygenator. I don't quite know what data they're using. How about a question? Let's go one more, Michael. Let's see.
I'm ready. Is this one for me or you?
This one's for you. I give it. You get the guest gets two, and I go first as a bit of a show of solidarity. Well, this is interesting. Very close to our last question. So, when someone lives in the past, what's the physical and mental cost on the people around them?
Oh, that's easy.
A little different twist, but same.
Well, I think, if someone's living in the past, it could be for, I guess, good and bad reasons. One could be that their past was just so good, right?
Good point. Excellent. I love
Yeah,
that.
yeah. And another is that, it was so bad they can't get over certain things and
Mhm.
can't move past it, and it keeps the people around them from moving past it. But for somebody who's living in the past, with good memories, it can also
Mm.
keep the people around them, especially if they're a lot younger. And I think parents tend to do this sometimes, when they reminisce about the past and repeat themselves
Mhm.
around younger people. It makes it hard for those younger people to sometimes endure some of those things, that, that aspect of the person they're
Of
with living in the past constantly. I mean, that there,
Yeah.
and listen, there's a spectrum of, how much in the past you are and about what, right? And,
Yes.
some people are really stuck, and some people just like to fondly reminisce. And, there's degrees, right?
I love it.
But listen, sorry, you don't have to listen. Um, I have a very dear friend who is since departed that used to love to tell jokes, and we were good sailing buddies. And a lot of us used to get together and go for the weekends and raft our boats up, and we'd all get together and have dinner on one of the boats and have cocktails afterwards and sit up late and watching the stars and telling stories and telling jokes. And he was a great joke teller, but he would tend to tell some of the same jokes over and over again. And
Mm.
he didn't seem to recognize that, the same people were around him.
Yeah.
So we had this signal, and it was when he started on one of those, everyone raised their hand.
Who's heard it before?
He was such a dear friend. I miss him so much. Anyhow,
Oh, those are fun. Well, this has been a delightful conversation, Michael. Thanks for sharing everything that's going on with sleep apnea. I mean, fascinating to me. Um, and 5%, you've got a lot of work ahead. You only got 95% of the rest of the world to save.
yeah, it's a lot, and I don't think we can do that by ourselves. I mean, I've been
Yeah.
telling our investors, what we'd like to do is double the 5% sleep apnea treatment rate within 5 years. And if we do that, we'll have a market cap, something like the leading CPAP maker, which is $20 billion. And if you stop and think about it, half the people that try CPAP quit within 2 years, which
Okay.
means 10% are diagnosed, 5% are treated because 5% quit. And if we can
Yes.
pick up that 5% that quit, that
20 billion is okay for a
yeah, but
market cap.
10% treatment
But
rate's not
but
okay.
I said, then I was going to say, yeah, but the 10% is
No,
dismal.
that's not impactful.
That's not yeah, you're not making a difference.
Well, we are. I mean, listen, the way you make a difference is one life at a time, right?
One, yeah, yeah.
But a 10% treatment rate for a disease like this is shameful, considering what it does to kids and turns them into sick
Hmm.
adults. That's got to change. Whether we do it or someone else does it, that's got to change.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Michael, thanks again so much. Great conversation.
good, Ken.
Very interesting. Very interesting stuff. And I love the idea that how much of a difference this can make in someone's life. Like you just said it perfectly, which is making an impact really is one person gets it and it changes their life for the better.
And the people
Um,
around them. Think about their
and,
family.
and and the people around them, the people that work for them, the people that they come in contact with every day, because they're
Yeah,
they're going to be, let's face it, it's going to be hard to be it's hard to flourish if you're not sleeping, if you're
it
drowning,
is.
all night. And
And it makes it hard for those that are around you, whether you work for them or you're married to them or they're your
yeah,
kids, because you're not your best self
you're not
for
your best
them.
self. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again. Thanks everybody for listening and supporting the show. Those of you listening on audio, first episode, check down below. I'm sure if you found us by now, there'll be a couple more episodes going on. Michael, I'll see you in about 20 seconds on the other side.
Good, Ken. Hey, thanks again.
Bye-bye. welcome to the Humanist Podcast. I'm your host, Ken Stearns. Join us